everybody, welcome to Vine Path. My name is Mariana and I am the wine buyer at Baco's Wine and Cheese. In Vine Path, every month we explore a topic in the world of wine and I pick 3 to 5 wines that explores that topic. This month we finally dug into a topic I've wanted to for a while, which is Washington State. I've been intrigued by the wines of Washington State since I first started getting into wine. I think for a state that has so much rich winemaking culture, I think it's a little underrated. Of really good value, you must try Washington State wines. So a little bit about Washington State and its winemaking. So Washington State is actually the second largest producing state in the US, right behind California. But while California is 84% of the winemaking in the United States, Washington State is just 5%. The geography of Washington State is actually really interesting. A lot of us might think of Washington as being a very wet state because we think of Seattle, but this is not the case for the wine growing regions. The Cascade Mountains go through, and on the eastern side of the state, it's actually desert. Very, very dry area. It's actually the continuation of the Sonoran Desert that starts in northern Mexico. It averages about 7 inches of rainfall every year. Thanks to the rivers in that area, especially the Columbia River, they can still use irrigation within limits to grow vines and other crops. Washington State is actually a huge agricultural state. Its top crops are apples, potatoes, wheat, hops, and grapes. The main challenges the state of Washington faces as a growing region: winter freezes. It gets really, really cold in Washington State, which is usually fine because the vines become dormant. But if there is any water in the vines and those freeze, because water expands, that sometimes breaks the vines. But every 7 to 10 years, there's a huge frost that will sometimes devastate vineyards, and that's something they have to look out for. The lack of water is another issue that they have to face. And then spring and fall time frosts. An interesting part of this state is that it has such a high latitude. If you think about it, the growing regions in Washington State, like Columbia Valley, is actually at a similar latitude as northern Maine. But the cool part about this is that it has really long growing days. So think of its grapes growing season from early spring to the fall. Those days are much longer than in California, for example. So during the summer, these regions actually get 17 hours of sunshine, which is 2 more hours than California. The reason east coast of Seattle can be so wet and the rest of the state is so dry is because the Cascade Mountains go through and create a rain shadow. So while storms hit the coast in Seattle, the Cascade Mountains provide a protection to the eastern part of the state. You can't talk about the geology of Washington State without talking about the Missoula floods. So the Missoula floods happened about 16,000 years ago. And what happened was there was a huge giant lake in Missoula, Montana, the size of about a Great Lake, but there was a glacier that was damming that whole area up. For about 50 years, every few years that glacier would melt and would cause ferocious floods. These floods would happen for about a week at a time, and the water would be going as fast as 80 miles per hour. This went right through Washington State and created so many valleys. It tore through the whole land, breaking apart structures. But one of the biggest things is that it deposited a lot of soils. So there would be layer upon layer of different deposits of specifically loess and basalt. Look at the landscape right now in this area. It's really unique, really beautiful. And it was a mystery for a long, long time until geologists figured out what it was that caused this. So as for the history of vine growing in Washington State, settlers started arriving in the early 1800s, but it wasn't until German and Italian immigrants that arrived in the 1870s that started planting vines. That winemaking culture was short-lived. Washington State was one of the states that really pushed prohibition in the early 1900s. And so other than grapes to make juice, there wasn't much winemaking happening. The restart after prohibition took a while. It wasn't until the 1950s that Vitis vinifera really started being planted. Actually, Washington State University took a huge role into figuring out what grapes were best suited for these soils. And there were some wineries that really took off, like Chateau Saint Michel, that became famous for its Riesling. In 1972, the LA Times actually did a blind taste to taste what the world's best Riesling was, and Chateau Saint Michel won, and it beat German and Australian wineries. So that was a huge win for Washington State wines. So Washington State has a lot of AVA. Columbia Valley is the biggest, and within that there are sub-regions such as Yakima Valley, and within that Red Mountain. There's also the Walla, which is probably the most famous wine region in Washington. So by the 1980s there were way more wineries all over Washington. In 1991, 60 Minutes came out with a report, the French paradox, and how heart disease in France was actually quite low, especially compared to the United States, and how they think that red wine drinking plays a role in that. And so a lot of people ate that up and started drinking more wine. And the number one planted red grape in France at the time was Merlot. Washington State took that and ran with it and really pushed for the state grape to be Merlot. And to this day, Washington State makes beautiful, lush, deep Merlots. But unfortunately, there was a big blow to the Merlot industry after a certain movie called Sideways. The main character repeatedly says he hates Merlot, using a little more explicit language. And a lot of people were influenced by that. Nobody wanted to drink Merlot. And so Washington State actually, to this day, pushes more of their blends, which they make beautiful blends with Merlot, Bordeaux style blends, so with Cabernet Sauvignon, Petit Verdot. But I think little by little we're going back to a Merlot accepting culture. I think Washington State wines have just this unique character of being deeply concentrated, that are just not shy wine. They're very expressive. They still have this acidity that doesn't keep them too heavy. It keeps you wanting more. Let's try the wines. So up first is Lone Birch's Riesling from 2021 from the Yakima Valley. Marcus Miller's family has 4 generations of farming both juice and grapes to make wine. One of the landmarks of their winery is the birch tree, that it provides shading for farmers, it provides direction, and it's just a landmark of the winery, so they decided to name their winery after it. So Marcus Miller's great-grandfather, H. Lloyd Miller, converted a former Army Air Corps into this farm, and they grew all kinds of crops and grapes, some for juice, some for wine, and now they have 830 acres of wine grapes. This is their Riesling. As I mentioned before, Washington State has a lot of history with Riesling. There's even German winemakers go into Washington State and make collaborations with some winemakers to make Riesling. It smells like wax and peach, unripe banana, pink grapefruit skin. On the palate, there's so much more clementine and pink grapefruit, a lot more citrus. The texture of this wine is very oily in a very pretty way, but it has a zipping acidity that wakes you up. Definitely one of those Rieslings I would want to pour someone that says they don't like Riesling because they think it's sweet. This is not sweet, but still very fruit forward. I would have this with some sushi. I think it would be really nice with a scallop sushi, red snapper maki. There's almost like a light bitterness. I think that would even go with like the nori in sushi. Up next, it's the 2020 Ex Umbris from Owen Rowe. I just love this like very simple label. Ex Umbris is actually Latin for out of the shadows and into the light. David O'Reilly started this winery in 1999. David O'Reilly is actually from Belfast, Ireland. Had kind of a slightly traumatic time there with his family and moved to Canada before settling in the Oregon, Washington area. He actually does make wines from Oregon as well. He's based in Yakima and gets grapes from respected growers in the area. In 2002, there was actually wildfires in the area, and the Syrah, they didn't think they would be able to really make much wine. They made a bottling of this 100% Syrah, and it was actually really delicious. There was just a touch of a smoky component that grapes it actually benefited. This is not always the case. Sometimes if there are wildfires, this is happening a lot all over the world, the smoke really penetrates through the grapes, especially in the skins. It can lead to overly smoky notes, especially when the wine ages. It sometimes comes out even more, but that wasn't the case in this. And they've since been kept bottling the Syrah. I'm a big fan of this wine. It smells like Bing cherries and pie crust even. So I would say like a big cherry pie, and lots of flowers, like roses. The palate is wonderfully balanced. There's like pomegranate, molasses, cranberries. The mouthfeel is very juicy, but then the tannins really come through. And there's like a light bitterness that reminds me of black tea. The finish is just like chocolate ganache with raspberry drizzle. I would pair that with some short rib ravioli. Something really rich that just needs that lift of acidity and tannin and bold wine that Syrah has to offer. Up next, we're gonna try Kiona Vineyards 2018 Red Mountain Cabernet Sauvignon. Their winery was started in the 70s. It's the Williams family. They really believed in the Red Mountain for good reason. It's a really interesting area. They get even less rain than the rest of Washington. It's about 6 inches per year. A lot of people say that this does wonders for the wine, because if vines get too much water, that goes more to the plants, to the vine itself. When there's less water, the berries actually are more concentrated and have more flavor. Also, the fact that the soils in this area are actually not that fertile. This makes the vines have to kind of fight for it more, dig deeper to try to find water. This creates a more difficult overall environment that makes the vines work for it more concentrated berries and interesting flavors, as opposed to these like really plump, juicy grapes that maybe don't have as much concentration of flavor. So the Williams family started planting a lot of vines in the 70s, specifically John and Scott Williams, but their family is growing and they're a much larger operation, but with still a lot of soul. 2018 Cabernet Sauvignon is really delicious. It is not a shy wine. It is very loud. It smells like eucalyptus and dried herbs and something like mapley and meaty, like a maple sausage almost. On the palate, it's like mocha, so that like chocolate coffee feeling, but still like that mintiness, almost like a mint chocolate. You can definitely taste that it's higher in alcohol. This is a 15.6% wine, but still I think overall it tastes balanced. This I want with a big dish like a wild boar bolognese, a wild boar pasta dish for sure. There's 45% new oak on this. It's a mix of American and French, and that's what gives all those like more spicy chocolate, even vanilla notes, but really well integrated. You can really see the Red Mountain, why it's so good for growing Cabernet Sauvignon. The grape gets really ripe here, but still maintains acidity that I've mentioned a few times. One of the reasons is for the diurnal shifts in the day. So even though it can get quite hot during the growing in the summer, with all the sunshine that they get, the temperature really plummets at night, and so it keeps the grapes really cold, disrupts the grape from getting overly ripe. Up next is the 2019 Bear Cub from Pursued by Bear. This is, I guess, what you would call a celebrity label. If any of you know Kyle MacLachlan, he's been in a lot of stuff like Blue Velvet, Twin Peaks, Desperate Housewives. He's a very quirky, interesting man. He's originally from the rural parts of Yakima Valley. Always had that dream to make wine. He's a busy man, so definitely with the help of some friends. The winemaker of this winery is Daniel Wampler. If you're wondering about the name Pursued by Bear, it's a stage direction in one of Shakespeare's plays, The Winter's Tale. Definitely a tip of the hat to Kyle's love of acting. I've heard Kyle talk in a lot of interviews about this, and it's definitely more a passion project than a financial investment. As the joke goes, if you want to make a small fortune, have a large fortune and buy a winery. So even though the AVA on the label is Columbia Valley, all the grapes here are from the Yakima Valley. And it is mostly Cabernet Sauvignon, there is a little Merlot, Cabernet Franc, and a splash of Syrah. The Bear Cub is entry level of this winery. Still definitely at a higher price point than what you would think of entry level, but I just thought it was a very youthful and vibrant, delicious red. It smelled blackberries and leather. There's a touch of vanilla bean. The palate, you get the tannins up front. Sometimes they hit you at the back. In this one, it's up front, and it makes you want to have to immediately take another sip. And then you get more of the depth. I can see why they call it the Cub. So this is a very youthful wine. There's more cocoa powder, and there's like a light smokiness that reminds me of beef jerky. I would want to drink this with a rustic dish, a shepherd's pie. And I think Kyle's personality really comes out in these wines, of an ode to where he's from, a respect for good wine and great viticulture and winemaking practices. He's also hilarious. If you follow him on Instagram, he has a whole series of videos of him and the mascot of the wine, Bear. The winery really comes to life. So the wines this month were not shy. They were very bold and proud of who they are. Very much an essence that I get from wines from Washington State. These are wines that I really want to seek out. When people from other parts of the world want to know about American wine, I think knowing about Washington wine is very important. And I've heard nothing but good things about anyone that's visited wineries out in the Columbia Valley. I hope one day myself to go. I would love to hear what you all think in the comment section or directly. Always feel free to email me. Thank you so much for joining me this month. Cheers!